The gunshot that killed Frank Lawson's wife echoed in his mind every night for 2 years, a sound that never faded no matter how much whiskey he poured down his throat or how many miles he rode across the Arizona territory. It was October 1882, when the fever took them both within 3 days of each other. First his newborn son, who never got to see his first week, then Margaret, who'd whispered their baby's name one final time before her eyes went still. Frank had buried them on a hillside overlooking their ranch, and then he'd left that place forever, unable to bear the silence of rooms that should have been filled with laughter and crying and life. He drifted through the territories for months after that, working cattle drives and odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to form attachments or answer questions about the haunted look in his gray eyes. At 28 years old, Frank felt ancient, worn down to nothing but bone and regret. The other ranch hands learned quickly not to ask about his past, not when they saw how his hands trembled sometimes when he thought no one was watching, how he'd wake from nightmares gasping for air. The town of Prescott, Arizona, became just another stop on his aimless journey in the spring of 1884. He took work at a ranch outside town, breaking horses and mending fences, earning enough to pay for a room above the general store and meals at the boarding house. The boarding house was run by a woman named Martha Chen, who'd married a Chinese railroad worker before he died in a tunnel collapse, and she served the best beef stew Frank had tasted in years. He ate there 3 times a week, always sitting alone at the corner table, always leaving exact change. It was on a Tuesday afternoon when everything changed. Frank had ridden into town early, his horse limping slightly from a stone bruise, and he'd left the animal at the livery with instructions to check the hoof carefully. He was walking past the bank when he heard the shouts, and then saw 3 men burst through the doors, guns drawn, canvas bags in their hands spilling silver coins onto the dusty street. The first shot came from inside the bank, probably the guard, and one of the robbers spun around and fired back through the doorway. Frank's instinct was to duck into the alley, to avoid trouble the way he'd been avoiding everything for 2 years, but then he saw the woman. She'd been crossing the street with a basket of vegetables, probably heading home from the market, and now she stood frozen directly in the path of the fleeing outlaws. She wore a simple blue dress and a bonnet that had come loose, revealing dark hair pinned up carefully. The robbers were bearing down on her, and Frank saw the wild panic in their eyes, the kind of panic that made men do stupid, violent things. He moved without thinking, his body remembering skills from a time before grief had hollowed him out. Frank grabbed the woman around the waist and pulled her hard to the left, both of them tumbling into the narrow space between the bank and the barber shop, just as bullets tore through the air where she'd been standing. The vegetables scattered across the ground, a potato rolling into the street, carrots crushed under boot heels. The woman gasped against his chest, her whole body shaking, and Frank held her there until the sound of galloping horses faded, and the shouting voices of the sheriff and his deputies filled the street instead. Only then did he loosen his grip, suddenly aware of how close they were, how he could smell lavender soap in her hair. "Are you hurt?" His voice came out rough, unused to concern. She pulled back and looked up at him, and Frank felt something shift in his chest when their eyes met. Hers were green, the color of prairie grass after rain, and they were filled with shock but also something else, a recognition of sorts. She shook her head slowly. "No, I'm not hurt. You saved my life." "Wrong place at the wrong time is all," Frank said, stepping back and picking up his hat from where it had fallen. "Both of us." People were crowding around now, asking questions, making sure no one was injured. The bank guard had taken a bullet in the shoulder but would live. The robbers had gotten away with maybe $300. Frank tried to slip away in the confusion, but the woman caught his arm. "Wait, please. I should at least know the name of the man who saved me." Frank Lawson." "Wendy Grant," she said, and even in the chaos of the moment, he noticed she didn't say Mrs. before her name. "I run the dress shop on 3rd Street. Will you let me make you dinner? As a thank you." Every instinct told him to refuse, to keep moving, to avoid this kind of connection. But there was something in her eyes, a sadness that matched his own, and he found himself nodding before he could think better of it. "Thursday evening, if that suits you," Wendy said. 6 o'clock. I live above the shop." Frank agreed and then watched her gather what remained of her vegetables, refusing his help, moving with a quiet dignity that made him wonder about her story. As she walked away, basket in hand, he realized his heart was beating faster than it had in 2 years, and the sensation was both terrifying and strangely welcome. Thursday arrived too quickly and too slowly at the same time. Frank found himself paying attention to details he'd long ignored, borrowing a razor for a proper shave, brushing the dust from his best shirt, even buying a small bunch of wildflowers from a Mexican woman selling them on the corner. He felt foolish carrying flowers up the stairs to Wendy's door, felt like he was betraying Margaret somehow, but he knocked anyway. Wendy opened the door wearing a green dress that matched her eyes, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way that made her look younger than he'd initially thought. Maybe 25 or 26. The apartment smelled like roasted chicken and fresh bread, and there was a table set for 2 by the window overlooking the street. "The flowers are beautiful," she said, taking them and finding a mason jar to use as a vase. "You didn't have to bring anything." "Seemed right," Frank said, removing his hat and feeling out of place in the neat, feminine space with its lace curtains and carefully arranged furniture. They sat down to eat, and for the first few minutes, conversation was stilted, awkward. Frank complimented the food, and Wendy asked about his work at the ranch. But as the meal continued, as the light outside began to fade into evening gold, something shifted. Maybe it was the way she looked at him when he mentioned working with horses, or maybe it was the silence that fell between them that felt comfortable rather than tense. "My husband died 3 years ago," Wendy said suddenly, setting down her fork. "He was 24. We'd been married for 2 years. A snake bit him while he was working in the fields, and by the time he got to the doctor, there was nothing to be done. I watched him die over 3 days, watched the poison work through his body while he tried to be brave for me." Frank set down his own fork, his appetite gone, replaced by a familiar ache. "I'm sorry." "Everyone is sorry," Wendy said, but there was no bitterness in her voice, only weariness. "But you're the first person who looked at me and understood. I could see it in your eyes on Tuesday. You've lost someone too." He hadn't planned to tell her, hadn't told anyone in 2 years, but the words came anyway, pulled out of him by her honesty and the way the evening light fell across her face. "My wife and son. Fever took them both in the autumn of 1882. The baby was 6 days old. I never even got to know him, not really. Just held him a few times, watched him sleep. And Margaret, she was everything. We'd known each other since we were children, got married when I was 23, had 5 good years together before." He couldn't finish, his throat closing up, but Wendy reached across the table and took his hand. Her fingers were warm and steady, and she didn't say she was sorry or offer empty platitudes. She just held his hand and nodded, and that simple gesture of understanding broke something open inside him that had been locked away for too long. "I don't know how to stop being sad," Frank said quietly. "Don't know if I'm supposed to." "I don't think we're supposed to stop," Wendy replied. "I think we're supposed to learn to carry it differently. My mother told me that grief is just love with nowhere to go, and I think she was right. I loved my husband, and now I carry that love around like a stone in my pocket. Some days it feels heavier than others. They talked until the candles burned low, sharing stories about their lost spouses, about the small things they missed and the big regrets that haunted them. Frank learned that Wendy's husband had been named Thomas Grant, that he'd love to sing badly and make her laugh, that they'd planned to have children but never got the chance. Wendy learned that Margaret had been a teacher before marrying Frank, that she'd read poetry aloud in the evenings, that the baby had been named James after Frank's father. When Frank finally left, well past midnight, he felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the names of the dead had released some pressure he hadn't known he was carrying. He also felt guilty, as if he'd betrayed Margaret by enjoying an evening with another woman, by feeling that flutter in his chest when Wendy smiled. But he came back. A week later, he stopped by the dress shop with an excuse about needing buttons sewn on a shirt. Wendy saw through the excuse immediately and invited him to lunch. Then there was another dinner and a walk through town on Sunday after church, and slowly, carefully, something began to build between them. They were cautious with each other, treating their growing friendship like something fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. Frank found himself telling Wendy things he'd never told anyone, about his childhood on a farm in Missouri, about learning to rope cattle from an old vaquero in Texas, about the dreams he'd had before loss taught him not to hope for too much. Wendy talked about growing up in Ohio, about coming west with Thomas chasing the promise of cheap land and new opportunities, about learning to run a business after his death, because the alternative was starving or remarrying out of desperation. "I had proposals," she told him one afternoon as they sat by the creek outside town, watching water skip over stones. "Decent men, some of them, but I couldn't bear the thought of marrying someone who looked at me as a convenience, a woman who could cook and clean and share a bed. I wanted to be seen, the way Thomas saw me, so I said no and figured out how to support myself instead." Frank admired that about her, the strength it took to choose loneliness over settling. He'd done the same in his own way, drifting rather than trying to replace what he'd lost. But now, sitting beside her with their shoulders nearly touching, he wondered if maybe they'd both been waiting for something different. Not a replacement for what they'd lost, but something new, built on the understanding that came from shared grief. The summer of 1884 rolled into autumn, and the cottonwoods along the creek turned gold. Frank found himself spending more time in town, taking on odd jobs that kept him close to Wendy's shop. He repaired her storefront sign when it came loose in a windstorm, fixed a broken window frame, delivered bolts of fabric from the freight office when they arrived. She insisted on paying him, and he insisted on refusing, and they'd argue about it with smiles on their faces until she'd pack him food to take back to his rented room as compensation. The other townsfolk began to notice, of course. Small towns didn't allow for privacy, and Prescott was no exception. Frank heard whispers, saw knowing looks, and one evening the ranch owner's wife cornered him at the boarding house. "That Wendy Grant is a good woman," Martha Chen said, refilling his coffee cup without asking. "Lost her husband young and didn't let it destroy her. Built a life for herself. She deserves someone who'll treat her right." "Yes, madam," Frank said, understanding the warning beneath the words. "You got ghosts, Mr. Lawson, we all can see that. But don't let them stop you from living if you've found a reason to." Her words stayed with him as the days grew shorter and colder. He thought about Margaret constantly, but the memory had changed somehow. It didn't hurt quite as sharply to picture her face, and he could remember happy moments without being overwhelmed by the loss. He wondered if this was betrayal or healing, and couldn't decide which frightened him more. It was Wendy who brought things to a head on a cold November evening. Frank had been helping her close the shop, pulling shutters and banking the stove, when she turned to him with unusual directness. "You think about kissing me?" she asked, her green eyes steady on his face, Frank's hand stilled on the shutter latch. "Yes, I think about it too. But I'm afraid." "Of what?" "Of forgetting Thomas. Of moving on, meaning I didn't love him enough. Of letting myself care about you and then losing you too." Her voice shook slightly. "I couldn't survive losing someone again, Frank. I barely survived it the first time." He crossed the room to her, moving slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted. But she didn't move, just tilted her face up as he came close. "I'm afraid of the same things," he admitted. "I wake up some mornings and forget for a moment that Margaret is gone, and then I remember and it's like losing her all over again. And the baby, I dream about him sometimes, about who he might have become, and it tears me apart." "So what do we do?" Wendy whispered. "I don't know. But I know that when I'm with you, the weight gets easier to carry. And I know that Margaret would want me to live, really live, not just exist. She told me that before she died, made me promise not to bury myself with her. Thomas told me something similar. Said if anything happened to him, I should find happiness again. I got angry at him for even suggesting it, but he just smiled and said he loved me too much to want me to be alone forever." Frank reached up and tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear, his fingertips brushing her cheek. "They were wise, our spouses. Wiser than us, maybe." "Maybe," Wendy agreed, and then she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, tentative, both of them learning the taste and feel of someone new. Frank felt tears on his cheeks and didn't know if they were his or hers or both. When they pulled apart, Wendy was crying openly, and he drew her into his arms, holding her while she shook with sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and old. "It's all right," he murmured into her hair. "It's all right to feel this. I feel like I'm cheating on him," she gasped. "Even though he's been gone for 3 years, even though he told me to move on, I feel guilty." "I know, I feel it too, but I also feel alive for the first time since I lost them, and that has to mean something." They stood there in the dimming shop until Wendy's tears subsided, until the guilt and grief settled back into manageable weight. Then Frank walked her upstairs, kissed her forehead at the door, and left before he could do something foolish like stay. Winter came hard that year, with snow dusting the higher elevations and frost covering the windows in the mornings. Frank moved into a small house on the edge of town, tired of rented rooms and wanting space of his own. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a lean-to for his horse, but it felt like the first step toward building a life again rather than just surviving. Wendy came to see it on a Sunday afternoon, bringing curtains she'd made and a quilt she said she had no use for. They hung the curtains together, and Frank built a fire in the little stove while Wendy made coffee from supplies he'd barely stocked. It felt domestic and right, and terrifying in its implications. "I want to court you properly," Frank said as they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside. "If you'll have me. I know it's complicated, I know we both carry loss, but I want to try, want to see where this goes." Wendy was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup. Then she looked up at him with those green eyes that had haunted his dreams. "I want that too. But we have to promise each other something." "What?" "That we'll be honest. About the hard days, about when the grief gets too heavy, about if this stops feeling right. No pretending, no trying to be who we think the other person needs. Just truth, even when it hurts." Frank extended his hand, and she shook it solemnly, sealing the promise. Then they both laughed at the formality of it, and the laughter broke the tension, letting them relax into each other's company the way they had before the kiss changed everything. Courting Wendy Grant was different from courting Margaret had been. He'd been young and foolish with Margaret, full of grand gestures and overconfident declarations. With Wendy, everything was quieter, more intentional. They went to church together, sat on her porch in the evenings when weather permitted, took long rides out to the creek to watch the water and talk about everything and nothing. There were hard days, too. Days when Wendy would cancel their plans because the anniversary of Thomas's death had her too hollowed out to be good company. Days when Frank would wake from nightmares about Margaret's last hours and couldn't shake the darkness until evening. But they kept their promise about honesty, and Frank found that sharing the hard days made them easier somehow. Christmas came, and Frank bought Wendy a beautiful comb made of silver and turquoise from the jeweler. She gave him a leather-bound journal, saying she thought maybe writing down his thoughts might help on the dark days. They exchanged gifts in her apartment above the shop, and Frank stayed for dinner, and when he kissed her goodnight at the door, it felt less like betrayal and more like possibility. The new year of 1885 arrived with cold clarity. Frank was helping another rancher move cattle to winter pasture when a late-season storm rolled in, trapping him away from town for 5 days. When he finally made it back, half frozen and exhausted, Wendy was waiting at the stable. "I thought something had happened to you," she said, her face pale. "I thought I'd lost you too." Frank pulled her close, not caring that he was covered in trail dust and probably smelled like horse and snow. "I'm here, I'm all right." "I can't do this," Wendy said into his coat. "I can't spend my life waiting for the next loss, jumping every time you're late coming home. It will destroy me." "Then don't," Frank said, pulling back to look at her face. "Don't wait for loss. Choose to believe I'll come back. Choose to trust that we get more than just grief." "How?" "The same way we do everything else, one day at a time, one choice at a time." She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "One day at a time." As winter softened into early spring, Frank realized he was happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of his youth, but something deeper, earned through survival and choice. He loved Wendy Grant, loved her strength and her honesty, loved the way she understood his silences and his stories about Margaret without jealousy. And more importantly, he was learning to forgive himself for moving forward, for choosing life over endless mourning. It was April when he decided to propose. He'd thought about it carefully, talked it over with the ranch owner who'd become something of a friend, even rode out to the hillside where he'd buried Margaret and James to sit by their graves and explain what he was planning. "I'll always love you," he told the weathered wooden crosses. "But I'm choosing to love her too. I hope that's all right. I hope you understand." The wind blew through the new grass, and Frank chose to take it as blessing. He proposed on a Tuesday evening, bringing Wendy out to the creek where they'd spent so many afternoons talking. The cottonwoods were just starting to leaf out, that brilliant green of new growth, and the water ran high with snowmelt. Frank had practiced a speech, something about building a future on the foundation of shared understanding, but when the moment came, the words fled. "Marry me," he said simply, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. "Not to replace what we lost, but to build something new. I love you, Wendy. I love your strength and your honesty and the way you've taught me it's possible to carry grief and still choose joy." Wendy's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Yes, yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring on her finger and they held each other beside the rushing water, two people who'd been broken by loss learning to be whole together. They married in June of 1885. A small ceremony in the church with Martha Chen and the ranch owner and his wife as witnesses. Wendy wore a dress she'd made herself in cream-colored silk, and Frank wore his best suit, and when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, they both cried and laughed at the same time. The wedding night was tender and careful, both of them nervous about this intimacy with someone new. They'd both been married before, but that somehow made it harder, not easier. Frank kissed Wendy slowly, mapping the geography of her body with patient hands, and she did the same, learning the scars on his chest from ranch work, the calluses on his palms. "Is this all right?" he asked more than once, needing her reassurance. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, it's all right. You're my husband now." And in the darkness of their marriage bed they found comfort and connection, a physical intimacy that felt like coming home to a place they'd never been. Life settled into new patterns after the wedding. Wendy kept running her dress shop, and Frank took a permanent position at the ranch, earning steady wages that let them save for the future. They lived in Frank's small house, and Wendy filled it with her touches until it felt like theirs rather than his. They had dinner together every evening, talked about their days, made plans for small improvements to the property. But they also made space for grief. Frank kept a photograph of Margaret in a tiny gown that had belonged to baby James in a box under the bed, and sometimes he'd take them out and remember. Wendy had a miniature portrait of Thomas on the mantel, and she'd speak to it sometimes, telling him about her day, about her new life. They didn't hide their first loves from each other, but wove them into the fabric of their marriage, honoring what had been while building what was. There were hard moments. The first time Wendy became pregnant, in the autumn of their first year of marriage, Frank was paralyzed with terror, reliving Margaret's death every time Wendy felt even slightly unwell. She miscarried at 3 months, and they both wept together, this new loss mixing with the old ones in complicated ways. "We can try again," Wendy said through her tears. "If you want to, if you're not too afraid." "I'm terrified," Frank admitted, "but I want a family with you. Want to fill this house with children and noise and life." They tried again, and Wendy got pregnant in the spring of 1886. This time Frank was still afraid but better at managing it, and Wendy was patient with his hovering and constant worry. They hired the best doctor in Prescott, made sure Wendy didn't overwork herself, prayed more than either of them had in years. Their son was born in January of 1887, healthy and screaming and perfect. They named him James Thomas Lawson, honoring both of the men they'd loved and lost. Frank held his son with shaking hands, overwhelmed by love and fear and gratitude all tangled together. "He's beautiful," Wendy said from the bed, exhausted but glowing. "We made something beautiful, Frank." "You did the hard part," Frank said, unable to take his eyes off the baby's face. "You're incredible." Little James thrived, growing chubby and strong, filling their home with the sounds Wendy had promised. Frank discovered he was a devoted father, patient with midnight feedings and endless diaper changes, singing badly to his son the way Thomas had once sung to Wendy. She told Frank those stories, and he incorporated them deliberately, wanting to pass on something of the man who'd loved her first. 2 years later, they had a daughter they named Margaret Rose, and Frank wept when he held her for the first time, this living memorial to the wife he'd lost. Wendy understood, had suggested the name herself, and she held Frank while he cried and told Margaret about the little girl who'd carry her name. Their life wasn't perfect. Money was sometimes tight, the work was hard, and there were still days when grief would ambush one or both of them without warning. But they'd built something real and lasting, a family forged from loss and choice and love that was different from what they'd known before, but no less genuine. On a summer evening in 1889, Frank and Wendy sat on their porch watching their children play in the yard. James was 2.5, chasing butterflies with determined toddler focus, and Margaret Rose was a fat, happy baby learning to crawl. The sun was setting over the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. "You think they'd approve?" Wendy asked quietly, and Frank knew without asking that she meant Thomas and the first Margaret. "Do you think they'd be happy about what we've built?" Frank reached over and took her hand, their fingers interlacing with the ease of practice. "I think they loved us enough to want us to be happy, and I am happy, Wendy. Despite everything, because of everything, I'm happy." "Me too," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I never thought I could be after Thomas died, but you've given me a life I didn't think I'd get to have." "We gave it to each other," Frank corrected. "You saved me as much as I saved you that day outside the bank, maybe more." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded, and the children's play grew more subdued with approaching bedtime. Inside the house, the photograph of Thomas still sat on the mantel, and the box under the bed still held Margaret's picture and baby James's gown. But they'd added new photographs now, images of their blended family, of second chances and hard-won joy. Frank thought about that day in 1884 when he'd pulled a stranger out of the path of bullets, how he'd been running from his grief and his past, how he'd felt like he'd died right alongside Margaret and their baby. He thought about all the pain he'd carried, the guilt and sorrow that had seemed like they'd crush him. But sitting here with Wendy warm against his side and his children happy in the yard, Frank understood something he'd needed years to learn. Grief didn't end, not really, but it could transform. It could become part of the foundation you built a new life on, could teach you to appreciate every moment because you knew how quickly it could all be taken away. The love he'd felt for Margaret hadn't diminished or been replaced. His heart had simply expanded, making room for Wendy and their children, for this second chance he'd never expected to receive. "I love you," he said into the gathering darkness, and Wendy squeezed his hand. "I love you too. Always." The children came running then, James demanding to be picked up, and Margaret Rose fussing to be fed. And they went inside together to begin the evening routine of baths and stories, and tucking small bodies into beds. Later, after the children slept and the house was quiet, Frank and Wendy lay in their bed, her head on his chest, his arm around her shoulders. "Thank you," Frank said softly. "For what?" "For understanding. For being patient with my ghosts. For loving me even though I came to you broken." Wendy propped herself up on one elbow, looking down at him in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "You weren't broken. You were grieving. There's a difference. And I loved you because you understood my ghosts too, because you never asked me to pretend Thomas never existed or that I was over losing him. We're a pair, aren't we? Two haunted people trying to build something good." "We're not trying," Wendy said firmly. "We've succeeded. Look at what we have, Frank. Look at our children, our home, our life together. We took the worst things that ever happened to us and somehow built something beautiful anyway. That's not trying. That's triumph." Frank pulled her down for a kiss, deep and slow and full of love and gratitude. When they finally separated, both breathless, he smiled in the darkness. "You're right. You're absolutely right." They made love then, with the quiet intensity of longtime partners who knew each other's bodies and hearts, who'd learned to communicate without words. Afterward, tangled together in contentment, Frank felt Margaret's memory settle peacefully in his mind. Not gone but at rest, approving of the life he'd built, the man he'd become. The years rolled on, bringing changes and challenges but also joy. James grew into a thoughtful, serious boy who loved horses as much as his father did. Margaret Rose became a bright, talkative little girl who followed her mother around the dress shop, learning to sew almost before she could read. In 1891, they had another son they named William, and in 1893, twin girls arrived, Elizabeth and Catherine, filling the house to bursting with noise and love and chaos. Frank expanded the house twice, adding rooms as their family grew, and Wendy's dress shop became the most successful in Prescott, eventually requiring her to hire 2 assistants. They saved money carefully, invested in land, built security for their children that neither of them had known growing up. But more than the material success, they built a home filled with love and honesty. They told their children about Thomas and the first Margaret and baby James, wanting them to understand that love didn't have limits, that you could honor the past while embracing the future. The children grew up knowing they were deeply wanted, that their parents had chosen each other and chosen to build this family despite the pain they'd endured. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1895, Frank and Wendy traveled back to the creek where he'd proposed. Their children stayed with Martha Chen, who'd become like a grandmother to them, and Frank and Wendy spent a rare afternoon alone together. They'd both turned grayer, gained lines around their eyes and mouths, earned the marks of a decade of living and loving and raising children. "Do you ever regret it?" Frank asked as they sat by the water, older now but still holding hands like newlyweds. "Marrying someone as damaged as I was." "You weren't damaged," Wendy said, the same argument they'd had 100 times. "And no, I've never regretted it, not for a single day. You've given me everything I thought I'd lost forever when Thomas died. A partner, a family, a reason to wake up happy. How could I regret that?" "I feel the same," Frank admitted. "I was so lost when I met you, so convinced I'd never feel anything but pain again. But you taught me that grief and joy can exist together, that choosing to love again isn't betrayal, it's courage." They kissed beside the rushing water, surrounded by cottonwoods and birdsong, 2 people who'd found each other in the aftermath of loss and built something lasting. When they finally headed back to town to collect their children, they rode side by side, comfortable in the silence and in each other's presence. The 20th century arrived, bringing changes to Prescott and to the territory itself. Arizona was pushing toward statehood, the old ways of the frontier giving way to something more settled and civilized. Frank was 46 years old in 1900, his hair mostly gray now, his hands still strong but bearing the marks of decades of hard work. Wendy was 41, still beautiful, still running her shop, still the woman who'd understood his grief when no one else could. Their children were growing up, James already 13 and talking about becoming a rancher like his father. Margaret Rose 11 and showing talent with numbers that made Frank think she might do something unusual with her life. The younger 3 were still in school, still filling the house with noise and energy. One evening in late spring, after the children were in bed, Frank and Wendy sat on the porch as they had countless times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, the air warm and sweet with the scent of blooming things. "I've been thinking," Frank said slowly, "about that day outside the bank, about how close I came to not stopping, to just walking away and letting fate happen." "But you didn't," Wendy said. "You saved me." "We saved each other," Frank corrected. "I was drowning in grief, and you threw me a lifeline without even knowing it. Just by understanding, by letting me talk about Margaret and James, by not expecting me to be over it or moved on according to someone else's timeline. You did the same for me. Everyone wanted me to remarry quickly after Thomas died, to find security and stop being so independent. But you let me keep running my business, keep my own money, keep my own life even while building a new one with you. You treated me like a partner, not a possession. You are my partner. In everything." They sat in comfortable silence, hands clasped, watching the stars wheel slowly overhead. Somewhere in the house, one of the children cried out from a dream and they both tensed, listening, but the sound didn't repeat. Just a normal childhood nightmare, nothing serious. "I want you to know," Frank said carefully, that I'm grateful. For every day we've had together, for every moment, good and bad. You've given me a life I didn't think I deserved, a family I thought I'd lost forever. And I love you more now than I did the day we married, which I wouldn't have thought possible." Wendy turned to him, her green eyes bright with tears in the starlight. "Frank Lawson, are you getting sentimental in your old age?" "Maybe," he admitted with a smile. "Is that such a bad thing?" "No," she said softly. "It's a good thing. It means you're not the haunted man I met outside the bank anymore. It means you've healed at least enough to let yourself feel joy without guilt." "Have you? Healed, I mean." Wendy considered the question seriously, the way she always did. "Yes. I'll always miss Thomas, always wonder about the life we might have had. But I don't wish I was living that life instead of this one. This is my life, our life, and it's exactly what I want it to be." Frank kissed her then, tender and deep, a kiss that held 16 years of partnership and love and understanding. When they finally went inside and climbed into bed, fitting together with the ease of long practice, Frank felt a peace he'd spent years searching for. The past would always be part of him. Margaret and baby James would always occupy a corner of his heart, just as Thomas would always be part of Wendy's history. But they'd learned to carry those memories as treasures rather than burdens, to honor the dead by living fully, by choosing love and joy and building a family that made space for grief without being defined by it. As Frank drifted off to sleep with his wife warm in his arms, he thought about that young man who'd buried his family on a hillside and ridden away convinced he'd never feel anything but pain again. He wished he could tell that grieving man what waited for him. That loss wasn't the end of the story, that love could be found again in unexpected places. But maybe that young man had needed to walk through the darkness to appreciate the light. Maybe the years of drifting and grieving had prepared him to recognize Wendy when she appeared in his life, to understand what she offered, to have the courage to reach for happiness one more time despite the risk of future loss. In the morning, he woke to the sound of children arguing over breakfast and Wendy's patient voice mediating the dispute. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the ordinary sounds of his extraordinary life, feeling gratitude swell in his chest until it felt like his heart might burst. Then he got up, pulled on his clothes, and went to join his family, ready for whatever the day might bring, secure in the knowledge that he was exactly where he was supposed to be, with exactly the people he was meant to love. The grief that had once defined him had transformed into wisdom and compassion, into an appreciation for every moment, into the foundation of a life well lived. Frank Lawson had lost everything once, had been convinced he'd never recover, but he'd been wrong. With Wendy's help, with time and choice and the courage to hope again, he'd built a new everything, different from what he'd lost but no less precious. And standing in his kitchen, surrounded by his noisy, loving family, watching his wife smile at him over the children's heads, Frank knew with absolute certainty that he was, against all odds and expectations, completely and thoroughly happy. The story of two people broken by loss who found each other and chose to build something beautiful, who learned that grief and joy could coexist, that love could be found again, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. It was a story without easy answers or simple resolutions, but it was true, and it was theirs, and that made it perfect.